Good evening. Welcome to Grace Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an 18-year criminal defense attorney who practices criminal law, and I will be providing the legal analysis in this case. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Happy to have you. If you like what we're doing, please feel free to like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And also let some of your true crime friend junkies know that, we're available. I also have a women's lifestyle channel podcast as well. It's called Recovering Perfectionist Mama, Grace in Progress. And so we'd really love to have you join us on that too, if that's something you're interested in. So today we're talking about the Menendez brothers, abuse on trial and justice on hold. What if the crime everyone remembers wasn't actually the crime on trial? What if the real question wasn't why they were killed, but why no one listened before they did? Tonight, we're not retrying the Menendez brothers in the court of public opinion. We are reopening the evidence that was silenced, the abuse that was documented, and the legal system that changed the rules halfway through the game. Because this case is not just about murder, it's about what happens when trauma is admissible and then suddenly it isn't. The crime everyone thinks they know. On August 20th, 1989, José and Kitty Menendez were shot to death in their Beverly Hills mansion. Lyle Menendez called 911 hysterically. The crime scene was brutal, multiple shotgun blasts. I believe Kitty had actually been shot through the eyes, I believe. At first, investigators suspected the mafia. But within months, attention turned to the brothers, the sons, Lyle, then 21, and Eric, then 18. The prosecution's theory was simple. Greedy sons, spoiled lifestyle, and inheritance motive. But the defense would argue something far more complicated and far more uncomfortable. The abuse allegations became the core of the defense. Both brothers alleged years of sexual, psychological, and physical abuse at the hands of their father, José Menendez. Allegations included sexual abuse beginning in early childhood, threats of death if the abuse was disclosed, extreme control, surveillance, and humiliation, violent discipline by both parents. Eric testified that the abuse continued into his late teens. Lyle testified he was abused first, and then when he confronted his father about Eric, there were escalations of threats. The night of the murders, August 20th, 1989. So they've been in prison almost, 30 plus years? José and Kitty Menendez are shot to death in their living room. Multiple gunshot blasts, overkill, indicating rage or panic or both. Lyle calls 911. Initially, police believe this may be a mafia hit. José Menendez was a powerful entertainment executive, but suspicion eventually turns inward toward the sons. The prosecution's theory, their narrative is very simple. Spoiled wealthy sons who wanted an early inheritance, and their lifestyle spending after the murders probably corroborated what was going on. And then premeditation. This was framed as greed, not fear. But the defense would argue that framing ignored the most critical evidence. The abuse allegations. Both brothers had alleged that. And the allegations included forced sex acts continuing into Eric's teenage years, threats of death if the abuse was revealed, physical violence by both parents. Eric testified that the abuse continued until just weeks before the killings. Lyle testified he was abused first, and then when he confronted his father threatened him. Let's talk about the fact that this was not just the two brothers that knew about the abuse. This was countless family members. This was corroborated by other means also. So this was not just a situation where they were making something up to try to save their skin, which is powerful in my mind. Especially given the stigma of the 90s of sexual assault and sexual abuse, the people were so different about it. There was almost a blaming the victim kind of mentality, if you remember that time. And then the Me Too movement happened many years ago, and people jumped on that because they were ready for it. So there was actually corroboration of the sexual abuse. This is where public memory often fails, honestly. The defense presented corroborating evidence, including testimony from family members, testimony from friends, psychological experts, childhood behavior consistent with trauma. This was not a case built on a confession alone. One of the most critical pieces of evidence, Eric wrote a letter to his cousin, Andy Cano, months before the murders. In it, Eric references his ongoing abuse, fear, feeling trapped, and inability to escape. This letter predated the killings, a major point for credibility. Andy Cano later testified that Eric had confided in him about the abuse long before the murders occurred. Again, somebody else who knew about that. The letter was devastating for the prosecution's fabrication theory because it didn't fit the mold in the narrative. So let's talk about the family knowledge and willful blindness. Multiple relatives testified that they suspected abuse, that they noticed disturbing behavior, that they knew Jose was violent and controlling, but no one intervened meaningfully. This becomes a critical theme. They actually failed Lyle and Eric. That is the juxt of this. And that is why this case is so sad and so disturbing. These guys have served almost their entire adult life after being sexually abused, after being victimized, after being treated poorly by their parents, because no one said a thing until after the murder occurred. Could they have potentially saved, Jose and Kitty's life? Potentially. Could they have tried to save the boy's life? Because if you're a person who's ever worked or known or met someone who is a victim of sexual trauma, it is something that changes a person. It literally changes their trajectory. And these boys, or these men, actually now, they're men. They started out as boys, but are now men. They have served literally since 1989. Literally, almost 40 years of this. So, I don't know. You know what? And it's a critical theme that all these people knew and no one did anything. Abuse doesn't need secrecy. It only needs silence to continue. And they've allowed it to continue by not looking out for their relatives. That is absolutely disgusting to me. As a person who has represented both sexual assault victims and domestic violence victims, and actually had a client who was murdered by her husband in a murder-suicide, I cannot imagine knowing something like that and not trying to do something about it. At least report it to the police. At that point, they were children. You knew that it was going on and you did nothing. Why? Were you concerned that Jose was going to get upset with you? Were you concerned that maybe he wouldn't be giving you money? I don't know what the motive was. Maybe they were afraid of him. They said he was controlling. They said he could be violent. But yet the boys endured all of this. Then the Menudo allegation kind of broke things up a little bit with Roy Rosello. Years later, former Menudo member Roy Rosello came forward. He alleged that Jose Menendez sexually assaulted him as a teenager. The assault occurred while Rosello was under the control of Menudo's management. He was drugged and raped. That allegation did not exist at trial, but it corroborates a pattern. And that is really important because it could have been presented, if they had had it at the time, as almost corroborating evidence for the fact that he's abused Lyle, he's abused Eric, and now there's this third party coming forward, which you're not using it as a bad character option. You're actually using it as evidence of a pattern. So it wasn't a one-off. While not adjudicated in the Menendez case, it fundamentally alters the narrative of Jose Menendez as an implausible abuser because it clearly shows that he is an abuser. So let's talk about trial one, when the jury heard everything. The first trial was from 1993 to 1994. Separate juries for Lyle and Eric. Abuse evidence was allowed. Expert testimony was allowed. Trauma response explained. The result, hung juries. You think about that, the hung jury meant that there were probably some who were thinking that the boys murdered because of the money. And there were probably others who were a little iffy on the sexual assault defense, given the fact that they were like, no, they're just looking for money, But I would think, though, from what I've seen at the trial, there was a lot of testimony from family members about the abuse and that they knew the abuse was going on. So, I guess they finally spoke up at one point, but it's almost too late at that point. There was not acquittals, not convictions. The jurors couldn't agree, largely because the abuse evidence created reasonable doubt, as it should. right? As it should. Let's talk about trial 2 when the rules changed. The second trial went from 1995 to 1996. This is where the case fundamentally shifts. Abuse evidence was severely restricted, expert testimony was limited, and the content was stripped away. In my mind, as an attorney, I don't understand how you could take a critical element of the crime and strip that portion away. You're essentially gutting the defense's defense, their ability to put on a case with their evidence. And that to me is just ridiculous. It is, I don't know. I think there's a lot going on there. The other thing though that we have to think about is all these crimes were tried around the same time. And the thing is, with the hung jury, LA was kind of suffering. There was like the Rodney King case. There was O.J. Simpson going on at that time. Then there was the Menendez brothers. I mean, there's all these, and the LA courts were not doing as well. The prosecutors were not having luck with that. And that was the big reason that they tried them a second time, because they wanted another bite at the apple. And so I kind of feel like the cards were stacked against them in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that it's okay to murder anyone. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that each person, it's part of our due process rights to have the right to a fair trial. And I think that given the fact that there was corroborating testimony and evidence about the sexual assault and the sexual abuse, that it should have been allowed. And I think that that was a major error. But that's my personal opinion. So the jury was no longer allowed to hear why the brothers believed their lives were in danger. That is a limiting thing for their ability to be able to put on their defense. They were left with the act, not the fear, and not the trauma. The result, conviction for first-degree murder, life without parole. And let's talk about the legal failure. This case raises disturbing legal questions. Can abuse be real if it doesn't fit juror comfort? At what point are we looking to give the jurors a comfortable ride to making the decision on a verdict, right? Sexual abuse is not comfortable. There's a reason for the longest time that it was hidden, swept under the rug, and people didn't talk about it in polite conversations. It makes people uncomfortable because it is uncomfortable. But you know who gets really uncomfortable in sexual abuse cases? The survivors of sexual abuse get really uncomfortable. And so if that makes you uncomfortable, like, you know, I'm sorry, but that's really not the point. The point is we need to bring these things to light. Things that happen that cause other people harm need to be brought to light so they can be stopped. So the people that do these things can be held accountable. Should trauma be excluded because it complicates motive? Absolutely not. I mean, the battered woman defense has been there forever. I mean, you could almost argue that the boys were battered. I mean, if they were physically, sexually, and psychologically abused, I mean, there's a lot there. Does justice change depending on courtroom rules? It can. And unfortunately, you have judges who, just like other people, have their own biases. And you don't know what your judge is going to be like until you're sitting before them. You know? And then you almost have to wonder, like, why it went one way and then why it went back the other. How did that work out? I don't know the full logistics of that. I do think that that is an extremely important question, and I don't think that it should have gone that way. But I mean, that is my personal opinion. But the answer in this case clearly was that a judicial change was made, and that altered the course of the Menendez brothers' life. So let's talk about where the case stands today. The Menendez brothers do remain incarcerated. public opinion has shifted about them dramatically. Given the fact the passage of time, time kind of changes things. The Me Too movement is a big part of that too. We also know that there's trauma-informed research. People now understand that trauma causes a lot of things for a lot of people. We also know that there's cultural reckoning with abuse. Like, we're finally not wanting to sweep it under the rug. We're wanting to actually have a real conversation. Jeffrey Epstein now, everyone has heard of him. Ghislaine Maxwell, people have heard of her. They've talked about the Epstein files. People have heard of that now. And people are sickened by that. Prince Andrew literally had to give up his royal title because of the collaboration, or whatever you want to call it, with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And then also the new corroborating allegations. I mean, these boys these men were telling the truth. Multiple legal experts now argue this case would be tried very differently today. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think that in some ways, the passage of time has kind of helped. I'm getting chills right now, guys. Sorry. The passage of time has actually somewhat helped them and shown that they were not greedy boys. Did they do everything correctly? No, they didn't. However, does anyone know how they would act in a certain situation unless they've been through that situation? So I am not judging them whatsoever. So here's what we know and what we don't. Abuse allegations were corroborated. Evidence existed before the murders, and the rules changed the outcome. What we don't know whether the killings could have been prevented. We don't know whether intervention could have saved lives. We don't know whether justice was truly served. This case isn't asking us to excuse murder. It's asking us to confront a system that says we believe victims, but only when it's convenient. And that may be the most chilling verdict of all. The Menendez Brothers isn't about greed versus innocence. It's about what happens when abuse is proven and then silenced. If you believe that trauma deserves context, follow Grace and Gavel and join the conversation. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope that you'll come back and see us again soon. Again, if you haven't subscribed and you like what you see here, or you have a topic that you would like me to cover, I'd be more than happy to do so. Feel free to let me know. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under Recovering Perfectionist Mama. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and happy holidays. Bye-bye.